I have a Federal Reserve chart in front of me from 1947 through 2024. Two lines. The first line tracks worker productivity in America. The second line tracks the median hourly compensation those workers received for that productivity. From 1947 until 1973, the lines moved together, almost touching, rising at nearly identical angles like two climbers roped together on the same mountain. Then, in 1973, the lines separate. Productivity keeps climbing. Compensation flattens. By 2024, the gap between those two lines represents roughly 75 years of wages that workers produced but never received. That gap has a name in economic literature. It is called decoupling. What it meant in practice was the end of the deal that built the American middle class and the beginning of the world you live in right now. My father bought his first house in 1969 in Cleveland, Ohio. He was 26 years old. He worked as a machinist at a Fisher body plant, making components for General Motors vehicles on the assembly line. His annual salary that year was $7,800. The house he bought, a 3-bedroom bungalow with a single bathroom and a detached garage on East 140th Street, cost $14,000. He put down $700, financed the rest at 6% interest over 20 years, and his monthly mortgage payment was $89. His wife, my mother, did not work outside the home. She raised 3 children. They owned one car, a 1967 Chevrolet Impala he bought used for $1,200, paid off over 2 years. Every Friday, he brought home his paycheck, $150, and every Friday, my mother went to the grocery store with $30 in cash and bought enough food to feed 5 people for a week with money left over. In the summer of 1971, my parents took all 3 of us to Lake Erie for a week and rented a cabin for $60. These are not impressive numbers. This was not wealth. This was normal. A man with a high school education working 40 hours a week in a factory could afford a house, a car, a wife who stayed home, 3 children, groceries, and a vacation on a single paycheck without debt beyond the mortgage. That sentence describes a world that no longer exists, and the people who remember it are still alive to tell you it was real. The average home price in America in 1970 was $23,900. The median household income that same year was $9,870. That is a ratio of roughly 2.4 to 1. A house cost about 2.5 years of a family's total income. By 2023, the median home price was $416,000. The median household income was $74,600. That ratio is 5.6 to 1. A house costs more than twice as many years of income as it did in 1970, and that is with 2 incomes instead of 1, because the single-income household capable of homeownership has functionally ceased to exist outside the top 15% of earners. In 1970, 32% of American households were supported by a single breadwinner, almost always male. By 2023, that figure was 16%, and among those 16%, the majority earn in the top 2 income quintiles. What was once the default arrangement of working class and middle class life became the luxury of the affluent. The ability to raise children while one parent remains home went from a widespread norm to a class marker, and it happened within a single generation. The economic architecture of the 1960s was built on a foundation most people never thought about because it simply worked. Union membership stood at 28% of the American workforce in 1970 compared to 10% today. Those unions negotiated contracts that included automatic cost of living adjustments, meaning when prices went up, wages followed within months, not years or never. A factory worker at General Motors in 1970 earned the equivalent of $33 per hour in today's money when you account for benefits. The same job today, where it still exists, pays $28. Pensions were standard. You worked 30 years, you retired with a defined benefit that paid you a fixed amount every month until you died. Social Security was supplemental. The pension was the foundation, and the pension was common enough that it shaped how people planned their entire adult lives. Healthcare was cheaper in both absolute and relative terms. In 1970, the average American spent $253 per year on healthcare. Adjusted for inflation, that is $1,900 in 2023 currency. The actual average healthcare spending per person in 2023 was $13,000. That is not a 7-fold increase. That is a market that became extractive. The hourly minimum wage in 1970 was $1.60. Adjusted for inflation to 2023 dollars, that is $12.53. The actual federal minimum wage in 2023 was $7.25. A minimum wage worker in 1970 had 42% more purchasing power than a minimum wage worker in 2023. But the measure that matters more is not the minimum wage. It is the median wage, because that tells you what the center of the labor market could afford. The median male worker in 1973 earned $4.23 per hour in nominal terms. Adjusted to 2023 dollars, that is $27.91. The actual median hourly wage for men in 2023 was $23.14. That is a 17% decline in real purchasing power over 50 years, despite productivity more than doubling in that same period. The work got more efficient. The workers got poorer. Someone captured the difference. The policy response to that crisis locked in the decoupling. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker's explicit mandate was to break inflation by any means necessary. The means he chose was interest rates. In 1980, the Federal Reserve raised the federal funds rate to 20%. The prime rate, the rate banks charge their most creditworthy customers, hit 21.5%. Mortgage rates for ordinary borrowers reached 18%. The point of raising rates that high was to choke off borrowing, collapse demand, trigger a recession, and drive unemployment upward until workers lost the bargaining power to demand wage increases that kept pace with inflation. It worked exactly as designed. Unemployment rose from 6% in 1979 to 10.8% by late 1982. Factories closed. Unions, already weakened by globalization and the shift to service employment, were gutted. The air traffic controllers' strike in 1981, crushed by Ronald Reagan's decision to fire 11,000 workers and ban them from federal employment for life, sent a signal to every employer in America that labor had lost. Wages stagnated, inflation fell. Asset prices, once the recession ended, began to climb. The people who owned assets got richer. The people who sold their labor got nothing. The corporate response to the Volcker recession was not to restore the old balance once inflation stabilized. It was to institutionalize the new one. Companies that had offered defined benefit pensions began freezing them in the 1980s and replacing them with 401k plans, a vehicle originally designed as a supplemental savings option for executives under Section 401k of the Internal Revenue Code, passed in 1978. By the mid-1990s, the 401k had become the primary retirement vehicle for most American workers, which meant retirement security was no longer a guarantee tied to years of service. It was a gamble tied to market performance, individual savings rates, and employer match rates that were always discretionary. The risk shifted from the corporation to the worker. The same pattern played out in healthcare. Employer-sponsored health insurance, which had covered 80% of costs on average in 1970, shifted toward high-deductible plans that covered 60% or less by the 2010s. The wealth concentration that followed is visible in a single statistic. In 1970, the top 1% of American households held 23% of total wealth. By 2023, they held 35%. The bottom 50% held 3.6% in 1970. By 2023, 1.5%. The middle class shrank from 61% of adults in 1971 to 50% in 2023. The mechanisms that had allowed upward mobility were systematically dismantled or priced out of reach. The same house my father bought in Cleveland for $14,000 in 1969 sold in 2022 for $187,000. That is a 13-fold increase. Sounds like appreciation. Except his wages, had they tracked with productivity the way they did before 1973, would have increased 15-fold in that same period. The house became more expensive in real terms, even as it appeared cheaper in nominal terms, because the dollar he earned bought less and the dollar he needed to borrow cost more. The mortgage he paid off in 1989 carried a 6% interest rate. The mortgage a buyer needed in 2022 for that same house, assuming a 20% down payment, carried a rate between 6 and 7% again after years of historically low rates. But the principal was 15 times larger and the buyer's wages had not kept pace. The monthly payment my father made in 1969, $89, represented roughly 14% of his take-home pay. The monthly payment for that same house in 2022, approximately $1,300, represented 31% of the median take-home pay in Cleveland. The house stayed the same. The deal changed. The chart still sits in Federal Reserve databases, public, archived, accessible to anyone willing to look. Productivity and compensation, 1947 to present, updated quarterly. The lines that moved together for 26 years and then split. The split is not a mystery. It is not a natural phenomenon. It is the result of decisions made by people whose names are in the public record, whose testimony is in congressional transcripts, whose policies are in the Federal Register. Paul Volcker is dead. So is Milton Friedman, whose monetarist theories provided the intellectual justification for prioritizing inflation control over wage growth. The system they built remains. It runs on inertia and incentive. The people it serves are the people who own assets. The people it extracts from are the people who sell their time. Your father's salary bought a life. Yours buys time until the next paycheck. That is not a coincidence, and it did not happen by accident.